Okay, welcome back. It is 5/26 of 2015. We're going to take a look at a transition in topics. We're moving on to our third topic in thinking biblically. It's going to be Lacocque up first with the approach to Ezekiel 37. And we will go through the three moments of the Valley of Dry Bones, the preface to being the bones filled with the Spirit, and then on to the word event. So the second moment is not going to be the actual baptism of Spirit. It's going to be the preparatory work for the baptism of Spirit. In the first moment, Lacocque tells us Ezekiel is the new Moses. He seeks to revive the dry bones of Israel, and he will participate in his own oracles. He is living in Babylon itself, so he is the prophet of the exiles. He focuses on the Lord's doxa glory, and he speaks of the Lord's doxa glory in exile within Jerusalem, actually leaving the temple, and then ultimately returning to a new Jerusalem. So this centrality of the vision is concerning the doxa glory of the Lord, which normally would reside in the temple in Jerusalem. But it will not return to Jerusalem until the temple is completely destroyed, because God is now to be understood as the God who cannot be contained. So destruction of the temple is due to arrogance and idolatry, but Ezekiel tells the people that there is a remnant, that there does exist a possibility for renewal with this remnant. In the second moment, we move on to that preparatory work for the filling of the Spirit in order to bring forth this new people in New Jerusalem. So it is a new birth. It's a new birth that will result in a new temple, a new people. It will involve prophetic participation. In fact, the initial emergence appears in Ezekiel's own home, which became a type of Babylonian synagogue. It does emphasize, as I mentioned, discontinuity. Ezekiel announces the breaking of the hereditary chain with the former guilt and punishment of the Israel of Egypt. So this new understanding evolves. The new Moses proclaims the dawn of a new understanding of covenant. The new understanding will be a new understanding that will be shared among nations, so it emphasizes universality. God's identity will now be apprehended through word event, and so that constitutes the human recognition after a divine action, and that is the goal of God's actions, according to Ezekiel, is to gain the recognition of his people. Now, the interpretive vision of the dry bones is a teleology of sorts, so it has a teleological character in 9 points. The goal of the vision is for Israel to recognize Yahweh as Lord, so it's lordship. It's Yahweh-centered. It is not anthropocentric. It is not centered around the concept of humanity. It is centered around the concept of Yahweh God. It is eschatological in character, as we have mentioned. It inaugurates the advent of a new covenant. It's not going to be a covenant of a heteronomy of a list of prohibitions anymore. It's not going to be the stone tablets. We're evolving to a new covenant that will not be heteronomy. It will instead involve an internal spiritual theonomy. We discussed theonomy in the previous lesson. It'll be an internal spiritual theonomy with an internal filling or an internal baptism of Spirit. But it still will evolve out of a pattern of wandering, though it is going to be a transformation conditioned by wandering, just as the Egyptian exile and deliverance was conditioned by wandering in order to create education. Failure must be the preface, must be a recognition of failure that precedes this evolving new covenant. Israel has deteriorated into a periodization of failures, and those must be faced. Basically, Ezekiel says that the conquest of Canaan was only accomplished because God fulfilled his oath, had nothing to do with the faithfulness of the nation of Israel. The second giving of the law resulted in no change of the people's hearts, and there resulted therefore a scattering of the tribes as a punishment, and ultimately it resulted in this Babylonian exile. So it's become a negative teleology. The telos has resulted in Israel as a valley of dry bones, being long dead. So it's very much emphasizes the fact that the Israel of the Egyptian exile and deliverance, that Israel is dead. It is dry bones. The concept of salvation history must be entirely reappropriated, and so this renewal cannot proceed until Israel first faces and recognizes this interpretive, destructive teleology that the Egyptian Israel has been involved in and brought upon themselves as a self-destruction. So the third moment of word event is when we look toward the eschatological raising up of a living multitude of a new Jerusalem. It's a paradise regained, a return to the beginning. The absoluteness of chaos, where the Israel of Egypt exists, needs transcendence through the word event of Yahweh. The dry bones are to be filled with spirit and become a living multitude as a paradise regained. So it's a new creation schema, and it is sketched out in verses 14 and 23 to 28. It constitutes a return to the beginning, a return to spiritual salvation history beginning. There is a necessity of first recognizing and facing the dry bones in the valley ossuary bone box of the actual Israel being dead and buried. Creation and history itself will spill over in the new covenant to benefit the whole of creation, but that can only be actualized after recognition in a second moment of the negative teleology. And depth of recognition, Ezekiel says, must extend all the way to the destruction of the temple, and the loss, key here, the loss of the doxa glory of God's presence, of Yahweh's glory, doxa glory. It has been lost to Israel along with the destruction of the temple. So recognition has to look that deep, to that kind of a depth of loss, that kind of a depth of being buried. So Ezekiel's vision is going to address all of creation, the spillover that will bless all of creation. But it's only through death, it's only through this second moment of death, that another eschatological people can be born. The Kephale head, alignment type consciousness of this new body of people, will be a David-like Prince of Peace, but he will be minus the temptation and abuses of covenant that the David of 400 years prior possessed. Because the David of 400 years prior never spiritually matured beyond that of skeleton spiritually. A new language will be born, and it will be situated within the vision which evolved of the dry bones. 7 concepts will be rewritten: creation, covenant, David, the nation Zion, temple, liturgy, and Torah. All will be rewritten concepts, and the dry bones vision is situated between the vocation, judgment, moment of recognition, and the eschatological upcoming promised New Jerusalem. It is situated within that context. So it's kind of interesting. We get a triad here. We don't reach a fulfillment. This first lesson, Lacocque wants to point out that what we really need to recognize is that Ezekiel begins by emphasizing a teleology of absolute chaos and negativity. And Israel, to be reborn, must be dead and buried and then be resurrected to a New Jerusalem through a Prince of Peace. But it cannot evolve to becoming a New Jerusalem of a Prince of Peace with a now internal covenant instead of a heteronomy of an external set of stone tablets. None of this can happen until they first face and internalize the fact that teleology of chaos has resulted in the death of the prior Israel. That's extremely important to Ezekiel. So this first lesson is all about an actual teleology of chaos and negativity that eventually resulted in spiritual death, to the point of even the bones being stripped and dried, as in an ossuary. And so it is a very negative picture that we begin with here, but I think the point has to be made that before new birth can occur, first you must be buried to that old teleology of chaos. The teleology of chaos must be viewed as dead, as buried, in need of only one deliverance, and it has to be transcendence. So it's an anticipatory vision of transcendence that we begin with. We'll pick up from here next time at page 151.